Right then, well, it looks like people are coming in thick and fast, and I'm very keen to keep us to time today because we've got a lot to cover. So we will start with the webinar. Hello and welcome. I'm Standerwick, Chief Executive of Maritime London, and I'm very pleased to be partnering with LOC on this webinar exploring the safe carriage of COVID-19 vaccines. I think I've lost count of the number of webinars that Maritime London have been involved in this year. And while I never get weary of learning and talking about the various issues affecting the market and of course our members, I cannot think of a more prescient subject matter than the one that we are discussing today. It is of course a marvel of science and testament to the endeavour of those working on these vaccines that we are in a position of having one vaccine approved and two now in the final stages of that approval process. And society can begin to see a way out of the omnipresent drudgery and in many instances despair that has shrouded us all as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, underpinning the collective hope of ending this pandemic is the safe and effective distribution of these vaccines. And as the Prime Minister highlighted only yesterday, what faces us is one of the biggest logistical challenges of modern times, and one that, of course, the shipping industry will be central to. Given the sensitivity and value of the cargo and the levels that will be shifted, the numerous pre-existing requirements that shippers and carriers must comply to, and the inherent complexity of a casualty investigation, wherever you turn, it seems to me that there are a number of interdependent variables that require consideration when looking to ensure the safe carriage of these vaccines. And when you couple this with the fact that box ships on certain routes are currently working to capacity, and domestically there is still, should we say, a certain amount of uncertainty when it comes to UK's custom protocols in 2021, one can't help but feel that we have an interesting time ahead of us. But rest assured, we have a great panel lined up today to discuss these various and vexing issues. We have Amarinder Singh Brar, Master Mariner and Shipping Consultant at LOC, Thomas Starr, Senior Claims Director, Master Mariner and Solicitor at the UK P&I Club, Rod Johnson, Marine Director and Master Mariner at Stephenson Harwood, and to guide us through or marshal us through, shall I say, the question and answer session that we'll have at the end of the Q&A, we have Simon Pollard, Naval Architect and Shipping Technical Director at LOC. Before we get started, I'll run through a number of housekeeping notices. We're all well versed in webinars now, but technical issues do occur now and then, and if they do on this webinar, please do bear with us. We'll do our best to minimise background noise, but those who have listened to other Maritime London webinars will understand that we do have builders doing a significant extension next door, so apologies for any drilling or anything else that you may hear. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be sent to all of those who have registered today. And lastly, but importantly, you will be able to ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to cover off as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentations. So that's all from me for now. I will sort of reapparate at the beginning of the question and answer session. But for now, I will hand over to Rod, who is going to look at the sort of potential complications when it comes to pharma cargo. So, Rod, thanks very much, and over to you.
There you go. Remember to unmute first time. So first of all, Joss, thank you very much to Maritime London and to LOC for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to be spending about 10 minutes talking about how the pharma supply chain works, and then perhaps digging into how the actors interrelate when vaccines being shipped by sea. So I think where we'll start with is the pharma supply chain. Can we have the next slide, please? So here it is. Now, the global pharma market is worth about $1.3 trillion, and that's the whole spectrum of medicinal drugs. And the supply chain works on a very simple principle. It takes pharmaceuticals from a manufacturer and moves them by a variety of means to the patient. And in between, there are distributors, shippers, carriers, and the way that the distribution happens in country, I would call it the final mile, but it's probably the final 100 miles, varies from market to market in terms of how the contractual arrangements work and who does what. So in some territories, it goes to the pharmacy, or it goes to a hospital, or it goes to a wholesaler, or it can go direct to the patient. But it's fairly complicated stuff. Now we're focusing today on vaccine, and the thing about vaccine is it has active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, which means that it's not exactly alive, but it's perishable. Now the supply chain it's complex, and its biggest challenges are probably matching supply with demand, particularly where the pharma is perishable, maintaining complete traceability, because obviously these are medicines, and the various regulators in Europe, it's the European Medicines Agency, has some very stringent rules about how pharma companies can move stuff around. So it has to have complete traceability. And it's got to be able to move between modes, and most vaccines are chilled cargoes, typically at anywhere between -4 to +2 degrees. What makes some of the COVID-19 vaccines novel is that they have very different carriage temperatures, and although some of them are in range, most notably the Pfizer vaccine just launched by the UK needs to be moved around at -70, and although you can warm it as you get along the distribution chain, it's not injected into your arm at -70, I would hasten to add. But obviously there's a strong cold chain element to moving that stuff around, which hasn't been done before. Typically a conventional reefer box can handle temperatures down to about -50, and even the packaging for this stuff is carried as a pharma cargo and is subject to the same stringent conditions that the actual pharmaceuticals are. Now, probably the most interesting thing that commentators inside the pharma industry would say is they still haven't cracked this issue between supply and demand. So typically there is buffer stock in country, and I'm sure we'll all remember when the pandemic started and we all went into lockdown. Not only could you not buy toilet roll, but you couldn't buy paracetamol or ibuprofen because the supply chain broke down in the face of the increased demand. And the reason that didn't leak across into other pharmaceuticals that are used for common ailments is that there was already a larger buffer stock for Brexit, in anticipation of a no-deal Brexit. So to that extent, in the UK, we didn't feel it as much as we could have done. But like any supply chain, it's vulnerable to disruption. And as I've said, the slightly lower carriage temperatures of the new products will stretch existing cold chain logistics. Now, in terms of value, the cost per dose varies from about $5 to $50. That's for the end user. So it's high value cargo. Typically, it's shipped to a maximum value per box for insurance purposes, and not by volume or weight, because it doesn't weigh anything. So a typical 20-foot unit will have about 120,000 doses in it. And to give you a sense of the volume, COVAX, the US consortium that's going to be developing and moving the US vaccine, and they have promised to send this anywhere in the world, they're planning on moving 1 billion doses by sea per year by the end of next year. Because if you think about it, most of these vaccines are two-shot deals, and there are 7.1 billion people on the planet, and therefore potentially you've got a market of 14 billion doses. I don't think we're going to need that much. Scientists say that I think once we get 60% of the population vaccinated, the virus goes into retreat. Anyway, I'm signing up early if I can get one. But they're the sort of the facets of the global supply chain. It is multimodal. So it's containerized trucks, trains, ships. Now, there are some choke points that already exist in the supply chain, and they've been exacerbated by the pandemic, and they would be typically around ports. What's happened is obviously when trade shrunk very rapidly, what we saw were container terminals filling up quite quickly. Good example, there's quite a large number of containers stuck at Felixstowe full of PPE that are blocking bays and aren't moving at the moment. So we saw container terminals filling up, blanked sailings, reduced capacity, disposal of some ships. So there was a very sharp break on the existing global supply chain, and it's slowly coming back to life, but at different speeds and in different markets as the virus affects different territories differently. But we can still see, or we can anticipate, that there will be disruption in the supply chain as we start to move stuff from the developed world to the developing world. The other thing that's not helping is the dramatic reduction in scheduled, particularly long haul flights, has taken out an element of capacity for the rapid movement of perishable cargo. Most scheduled flights had cargo on, but of course there aren't so many scheduled flights at the moment. So the volume of cargo that can be moved by air under normal circumstances just isn't there. So I think, to summarize, the pharma supply chain is already complicated for the particular medicine that it's moving. Vaccines have active pharmaceutical ingredients which make them perishable. The new vaccines are more perishable than most, and we're in a situation where the global supply chain is already under a little bit of pressure from the pandemic. Now, this slide here is it gives you a sense of the multiple actors that are involved once the container gets onto the ship, and I'll just run through them very quickly. Obviously, there's cargo insurance. For the ship, you've got the head owners, the charterer, the slot charterer, and the vessel sharing agreement partners. There's the terminal operator, who may be indeed one of the ship operators, a hull and machinery, P&I. There's the shipper, the receiver, salvers if it all goes wrong, and of course let's not forget that the container shell itself has a value and is owned and insured normally by a third party. So all of these actors transfer risk and liability between themselves at various times by a variety of contracts. The one I want to look at first is cargo insurance. Now, typically, because of the huge values being shipped around, cargo policies for pharma are global programs, and they're normally fronted by major brokers into large markets, typically London. And interestingly, they all contain a thing called a control of damaged goods clause. And basically that gives the cargo owner, the shipper, exclusive control over what happens to the cargo if it is lost or damaged. And that's for three reasons, really. Firstly, it's brand protection. Secondly, it's to meet the regulatory requirements imposed on them, as I said, in Europe by the EMA. And lastly, it's to stop medicines entering the black market through theft. We don't often talk about theft of cargo, but it does go on. The news today is full of dire warnings from Interpol about cyber attacks on pharma producers and the likelihood that this cargo will be stolen. If it's if a box is stolen and it's part of a batch, then that whole batch would need to be recalled. So typically the pharmaceutical companies use this control of damage good clause to keep control of it, and it means there's no scope for adjustment, there's no scope for salvage. The claim is simply presented to the value of the box. Now, it's normally shipped on standard terms, such as the Hague-Visby rules. But the other thing about the loss of the cargo is that you can actually take vaccines out of their temperature range, but the pharmaceutical company will never disclose what that is. So for example, let's look at the Pfizer cargo. It's moved around at -70. but it's slowly warmed in different venues until it gets to your arm. That means it can survive at higher temperatures than -70, but for the purposes of shipping, if it goes out of range, that cargo will be deemed to be lost on the spot. So there's going to be a huge logistical effort required, and I think the most interesting part of this is the politicization of it. Now, we've been in shipping, we've been used to just doing our thing, moving 95% of goods around the world without anybody noticing or caring, and it's just all completely taken for granted. It's going to be slightly different now, I think, where we could expect to see a vaccine sailing on most ships. And I think the public appetite, or certainly scrutiny, for accidents that that disrupt the flow of this cargo will be greater. And I think we can expect greater political scrutiny and interest. I don't know if anybody noticed this morning, but when the announcement came out that the Pfizer vaccine owned by the UK was first, there was a little bit of beefing politically about, you know, was this jingoism or was it not? So expect more political scrutiny. I'm going to leave you with several thoughts or tips as to how to manage this. So remember, there are multiple actors, and the transfer of liability is normally linked to causation. So it's how the loss occurred is really very important. Notification of claims is in one of two places. It's either got quite a long tail because nobody notices until the pharmacy end when they open the box and it isn't right. But with vaccine cargo, it tends to be quicker because there are multiple points in the supply chain where the set point is monitored. If it's off the set point, it's lost, and in comes the claim. We can expect exposure risks to go up for cargo underwriters. MSC have just recently had to invoke clause 19 of their terms and conditions because there aren't enough reefer points available at Chinese ports for them to take the containers where they wanted to take them. Now, obviously, COVID cargo is being diverted doesn't bear thinking about, but there will be an exposure risk, a silent exposure, as these things accumulate in port. I've mentioned the control of damaged goods clause. The limitation regime will apply at sea, but of course, ports and terminals, losses in ports and terminals aren't subject to any limitation by convention. Subrogation prospects are poor. Road carriers are bad targets for subrogation, so the underwriter is going to be swallowing most of the loss unless they can turn to P&I, and Thomas is going to talk about more on that in a minute. And commercial imperatives, and I would say political imperatives, might make the trade-off of risk and liability a little bit more pragmatic than might otherwise be the case. So the thought that I'll leave you with is if you are involved in the shipping of COVID vaccine in any way at all, make sure that you've got good help, you've got it to hand, and if it all goes wrong, get help early. Thank you very much.
Rod, thank you for that, and I think you've given us plenty of food for thought for the Q&A session to come. And of course, you know, the impact that this movement of vaccines may have from the political perspective, putting shipping under the spotlight is one that perhaps we haven't given due consideration to, and again, one that we could cover off in a bit more detail in the Q&A session. But at this point, I'd like to pass over to Thomas, who is going to give us a background regarding cargo claims from a P&I perspective. So Thomas, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to talk a bit about the carriage of such cargoes from the contracts of carriage perspective and claims generally. First, I think it's just important to give a bit of background as to where those claims contractually are likely to come from. So we've got a bit of context before we talk more specifically about reefer cargoes and vaccines. So next slide, please. So it's impossible to sum up all the contractual relationships you're going to see in the ro-ro trade and the container trade in one slide, but that hasn't stopped me trying. On the left-hand side, you'll see a fairly simple, straightforward relationship you'd see in the ro-ro trade. Once the shipper, or the wide-ranging definition they often use in the ro-ro's term of carriage for merchant, has completed the booking process, they're generally directly contracted with the carrier, which is often the owner in the ro-ro trade, and then that carriage is subject to their standard terms and conditions, including Hague, Visby, or US COGSA in the case of North Atlantic ro-ro trades. Bills of lading or seaway bills are issued to evidence that carriage, and this might be part of an overarching contract of affreightment. On the right-hand side, container shipping, a bit more complicated. You've got the line in the centre there. That might be their name written across the hull of the ship. They will have, probably under a vessel sharing agreement or an alliance agreement, various slot charterers. The line may or may not be the ultimate owner. There may be a charter party above them to the owner. So I've got C1 marked in red there. If we have a cargo claim for our reefer container and our vaccine, that's likely to be passed up through the bill where slot A is the carrier. Slot A may try and pass that on to other parties, like the line under the vessel sharing agreement, and the liner may or may not be able to pass that up to the owner under the charter party. You can get problems where the terms aren't back to back and one of the parties in the middle could be left holding the baby. Next slide, please. So very generally speaking, carriers, as you'd expect, are required to receive, load, handle, stow and discharge the cargo, and that follows the general position under Article 3, Rule 2 of the Hague Visby rules. Just a note on ro-ros, where they may differ from container ships. It might be, the reefer unit might be port gate to port gate, not just load to discharge. In both the ro-ro trade and the container trade, you normally see that standard caveat on the bills where they're shipped in apparent good order, but there's no warranty by the carrier as to the contents, the quality, the status of those goods inside that container or reefer unit. I think Amarinder is going to talk in much more detail about the IMDG code, but whether it falls under the document of compliance with dangerous good or not, the owner, one way or another, will have to ensure that it complies with its statutory requirements for shipping vaccines, which are normally caught by the code in some shape or form. And remember, both ro-ro trades and container trades normally have quite wide discretion on transshipment, subchartering, subcontracting, liberty clauses, and so on. So you can see the issues with very temperature sensitive cargoes, which may be in specialised reefers if any of those discretions are exercised. Our cargo interest and merchant generally, as always, they've got to give the written instructions, any safety information such as the marine safety data sheet. They're responsible critically for the packing and securing of the cargo inside. And importantly, certainly for the carrier, that it's normally the cargo interest that warrants the adequacy of that reefer unit, and the carrier not being responsible for issues with that lack of maintenance or breakdown of the unit. As you heard from Rod, it'll be up to the cargo interest to make sure that the regulators and port health or the health authorities of the port state are satisfied, and the cargo interest will usually provide various indemnities under ro-ro and container trades as to problems with the inadequacies of the information or description, or, as I say, defective reefer units. Next slide, please. So ultimately, our COVID-19 vaccines are going to be shipped in reefer units, as we heard, specialised ones at that. And I think it's important just to look at how the ro-ro and container trades deal with reefers specifically. I think in the container trade, the box time clause 17b pretty much sums up the usual arrangement and usual division of responsibility and liability. I'm not suggesting that box time is used everywhere, but the clause is a fairly sort of typical arrangement. So owners are responsible for loading it, receiving it, whatever, and plugging it in and maintaining that power supply. They tend to endeavour to monitor the reefer in line with the charterer's instructions and maintain the status quo, if you like. However, if there's repairs required, the crew may attempt that, but when they do so, they're typically doing that as the charterer's servants, and the owners let them know if any specialist equipment or repairs are needed. but the upshot being owners aren't taking any liability for a malfunction of a reefer unit. In the ro-ro trade, the terms and conditions usually have a similar position that we see in the container trade, and you'll see terms like due diligence or reasonable endeavours to maintain the reefer. However, in some ro-ro trades, they try to go further and even try to avoid liability for an interruption in the power supply as provided by the ship. Next slide, please. So you can't talk about cargo claims without our old friend Hague and Hague-Visby, which are probably going to apply to the contracts of carriage. If they apply as a matter of contract, then they may well be qualified or partially incorporated. You typically see that in vessel sharing agreements, for example. However, they may be applicable by force of law, in which case the carrier is probably not going to be able to qualify or derogate its responsibilities from them. And as I mentioned, care of the cargo, which follows the position even in the contracts of carriage where Hague-Visby applies by contract only, the carrier is responsible for loading, handling it, stowing it and caring for it, etc. But let's not forget the Volcaf judgment, every carrier's favourite judgment, where if in the event of a cargo claim with our vaccines and our reefers, the carrier is probably going to find itself in a position where it bears the burden of proof to show that it was not negligent in caring for that cargo. So that goes against the grain of many jurisdictions, including England, where normally the party alleging the negligence, here our cargo interest, has to prove negligence, but the roles are reversed as a reflection of the bailment relationship between the parties. So the carrier, when dealing with the claim, has got to bear in mind the evidential burden that it's going to have to prove it was not negligent. Next slide, please. Service agreements, for want of a better term, I've sort of bundled them all into the term service agreements. And you heard Rod mention this about insurance arrangements. But with various sensitive and high value cargoes, including vaccines, from time to time, we come across arrangements where a line has entered into an agreement with its customer because the typical limitation regime you see in contracts of carriage is not commercially palatable for the manufacturer. So therefore, for commercial relationship reasons, the carrier has agreed in a service agreement to waive or limit certain liabilities, certain defences, or waive certain rights. For example, where the cargo can be rejected for the slightest bit of damage, which follows on from what Rod was saying about the temperature sensitivities or theft and so on. If that is the case, P&I cover, as dictated by the pooling agreements between the IG clubs, may well be prejudiced, and additional insurance would be needed. It can be the carrier that makes those arrangements. Often with pharmaceuticals, it can be the logistics company that takes out those sort of service agreements, and it's often the logistics company that will have that additional insurance in place to swallow those higher risks. But it's not unheard of that it could be a carrier, so that position needs to be kept in mind. And next slide, please. And just briefly, when it comes to claims, obviously the main culprit is going to be damage through the temperature sensitivity. But let's not forget, you could get leaks and spillage, and these are IMDG cargoes, and you could be looking at health hazards. The health authorities will take these seriously. You may find that you need emergency information from the shipper, as well as following the advice in the IMDG code, and as well as the actual damage element of the claim. You might be looking at delays, expenses, decontamination, and special arrangements and lay-by berths and all those kinds of things when the authorities get very excited in port. Like any claim like this, particularly high value ones, the casualty investigation on causation is going to be critical. You saw the very long logistics change which Rod spoke about. Finding out where the damage actually occurs will be critical for the carrier, because if it's in the road haulage element, that will be under different contracts with different parties, insurers involved. So evidence collection, including things like, was the reefer unit maintained in line with the CSC and so forth. But ultimately, if the finger of liability is pointed towards the carrier, We'll be looking at which defences and what limitations are available, bearing in mind if there's any cover issues and who's got that additional insurance and who was going to swallow those higher risks. But ultimately, it will come down to where we lie in those responsibilities for reefers in the terms that we saw slightly earlier. Next slide, please. So I think they say you're going to remember 3 things from any talk. So my takeaways for the contracts of carriage segment would be, firstly, you are effectively dealing with a reefer cargo claim, a perishable cargo, but they're very sensitive and they're probably carried in quite specialised pieces of equipment. Remember also that they're high value, so limitation defences will be as important as ever. Are there cover issues and additional insurance? And remember, you could be looking at a potential health hazard with the authorities and any delays and additional expenses on top of any damage element. And next slide, please. And thank you. That's all from me. I will hand back to you, Joss. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think you've segued very well into Amarinder's presentation. And Amarinder's going to be focusing on the practical considerations when it comes to the carriage of vaccines at sea. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Amarinder. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joss. And just a summary, I mean, a lot of people have been asking what phase of maritime transport would vaccine travel on, and it is my belief that it can be on all 3, and depending on how this pandemic proceeds, the volumes in different parts will change. For example, transoceanic, I do not envisage it in high volumes, even though high volumes per vessel, but it would be there. And then once the container is to a distribution center, or even, for example, within Europe, it can even be carried on ro-ro freight. And you know, we have a lot of island communities around UK. So there will always be the last mile delivery, possibly on ambulances or other smaller vessel modes of transport. And in all of them, the moment the vaccine comes on board a vessel, it falls under certain criteria. And I will discuss that. Next slide, please. Okay, so whenever you talk about carriage of dangerous goods to a mariner or a seafarer, immediately their mind goes to a few certain points. Is my ship certified? And yes, that is done at construction, outfitting, and service certification stage of the vessel. Then is it capable of carrying the dangerous goods? Yes, because the vessel is certified with a document called Document of Compliance. And what this document does is that it covers additional safety measures to provide fire protection on ships carrying these cargoes. And finally, by another part of SOLAS, the IMDG code is made mandatory, which talks about packaging, manifest, securing, and storage and segregation. Basically, how do you place that cargo on board? So this is what a mariner thinks about it. But when you dig into transportation of vaccine, something new comes up. Next slide, please. Actually, you'd be surprised to know that document of compliance does not apply to carriage of vaccines, because it specifically excludes UN class 6.2, which are infectious substances. And what actually kicks in is the remaining of the IMDG code, wherein it has got provisions for safety, securing, etc. Your safety management systems, which is similar to the ISO standards or a quality management system applicable on board. This is specific to the maritime industry. And it has got goals to achieve for setting procedures, for having training, and to be ready for any kind of emergency that you may have, and within which you will have, for example, fire. So even though it goes out of the purview of document of compliance, the ship and the company and the shore-based management of that ship has to think about these risks and address them before you even receive the cargo. And as Rod mentioned, this would be high value cargo. Actually, ship security would be a prime concern. And I think about my training days way back in late 90s, and we used to maintain anti-pilferage watches in certain ports, just rover rounds on deck to ensure everything is all right and there's no pilferage going on. So those kind of procedures would have to be brought back in, and I have not seen specific mention of anti-pilferage watches in standard ship security plans so far, whatever I have seen. So all in all, shipboard procedures would have to be updated as applicable to the vessel and trade. And surprise, surprise, if you think that this is all, no, it is not. Next slide, please. Well, actually, because you are transporting something that is highly infectious, there are a lot of other standards which kick in, which either come in from WHO or they come in from a different arm of the industry or the government, which applies to this. And these would apply at the interface between the ship and the port. And therefore, depending on the way the cargo is loaded or driven off, for example, if it's a ro-ro, then for example, I was searching on a few major organizations, maritime administrations, what are the procedures for IMDG 6.2 carriage? Believe me, I could not find any. And for this particular cargo, the IMDG code specifies that it is to be as per the approval of the competent authorities. And I could not locate that on their website. So in this case, if a ship is trying to carry this cargo, they would not only have to improve or develop their own procedures, they would also have to apply to competent authorities and provide an equivalent of safety measures so as to get that approval. Because without that approval, even if you are ready on the shipboard side, you would not be approved to carry. For example, the stowage position. Next slide, please. Okay, so once your procedures are ready, in short, just to recap, the ship or the company would have to get national and local approvals for all the three parts of the transport chain: port of loading, port of discharge, and the flag state of the vessel. If the vessel is going to make an intermediate call at any other port, then that approval would also be required. Then for cargo related, they would have to think about it and prepare where are they going to load the cargo. For example, I have with me a safety data sheet of a COVID vaccine. And one of the special hazards for fire is that formation of toxic gases is possible during heating or fire. So if I'm planning a stowage position on board, I have to make sure that it is away from a blower which is blowing in air. At the same time, it has to be away from an exhaust vent because I do not want to risk contaminating my venting system from these fumes. So onboard preparation would be the key. Stowage location would be the key. Care of cargo. I am purposely not discussing the carriage temperature. All I would want to state is that whatever the carriage temperature is given by the shipper and received, we have to check that it is received at that level, maintained at that level, and discharged at that level with proper records maintained. Now, when we look at IMDG code, there are discussions whether the vaccine would be carried in reefer containers, or it would be kept chilled with nitrogen, or it would be covered with dry ice. So in that case, not only class 6.2, additional subsidiary risks of class 2 and 9 may apply. And therefore, the stowage would be required to comply with the requirements of both the UN classes. Now, there are some packaging requirements and there are some quantity limitations depending on the mode of transport. Of course, the other special provision, stowage, security issues would need to be addressed. And while all of these are addressed as part of the ship's safety management system, An emergency response would have to be planned for, temperature control drills or procedures would have to be worked for, and the crew would have to be trained at least for fire, spill, and pilferage. For example, when we talk about crew training and also the safety management systems, the company is required to give equipment suitable for that job. And when I look at the safety data sheet, I see some standards for eye wear, hand protection, skin and body protection, and respiratory protection, which are not covered by the regular maritime standards. So a complete risk assessment has to be done, and we have to make sure that at least the personal protective equipment meets or exceeds the standards given by the vaccine manufacturer. And let's not forget compliance with the health regulations. Next slide, please. So this is a drawing of how a vaccine is required to be packaged for maritime transport. So on the left side, there is a primary receptacle, which is covered in absorbent material. And then it is covered in a secondary packaging, which is watertight. And then the complete packaging is put in another outer packaging with all the labels and the markings, and it is ready for maritime transport. It looks good, but there's a problem with this, and that is that all of this secondary packaging is in a way going to insulate the vaccine from the temperature control system. And that is why I kept away from the measure, whether it is dry ice or nitrogen padding or reefer container. In any case, when received on board, it would be properly packaged. But for the company and the seafarers, they have to be aware this is what is there inside. I did talk about quantity limits per package. So on the right side, if you look, if it is transported in a cargo hold of a passenger aircraft, it's only 50 ml per package. I am unaware of number of package limitations for air transport. When I look at cargo hold in a cargo aircraft, the package can be bigger. It can be a 4-liter package or 4 kg in one go. But when you look at surface transport, rail, road, and maritime, there are no package limitations. So I do not envisage a tank container full of vaccine going in per se straight like that. But the point is that the restrictions are less, and therefore maritime transport will play a part where there are restrictions on transporting the vaccine in larger packages by air, because trade at the end of the day is a trade-off between cost and time. Okay, next slide, please. And now, even if we have considered everything, we have planned everything, we have developed our procedures, we have got all the approvals, we've been able to talk to the government and get your approvals. There are some things that a maritime operator and the vessel has to consider. So one of them is that, is the equipment approved, fit for purpose? Can you get it on board? How do you do that? For some for some dangerous goods, there is a traveling pack of personal protective equipment which is actually carried with the DG cargo. So does that PPE come with the package? And now if the ship owner is not investing in that, then how do you train the crew in advance for those equipment? It would be unfamiliar for them. So they have to think about it. Or does the owner make a capital investment for cargo which he may just carry for, let's say, a few months, and then the supply chain is established or the pandemic is over? Then a lot of times you're talking with, you have to get approval from shore, but how familiar are they with the maritime systems? So I live in UK, MCA is a leading organization, but in many of the maritime administrations, policy is generated and discussed in silos. So LSA policy is distinct from firefighting policy, which is distinct from seafarer health policy. Whereas when you are looking at approvals, your approval has to pass the scrutiny of all of these entities. Or the ship owner can go at a level higher. For example, in UK, the level above is Department for Transport. So I looked up class 6.2 transport requirements for UK by road, Department for Transport, and all I could find was transport of infectious wastes. I could not find any procedure or method of getting this approval. So to get the shore support and approval, the lead time would be longer. Then I've already discussed about firefighting, what would be the ventilation protocols, and most importantly, how do you dispose of the water? For example, when I refer to the safety data sheet, it says that the hazards of this firefighting water to dump it out into the environment is unknown, and you must avoid doing that. But when you look at ro-ro ships, the design is such that their vehicle decks are designed to let the water out in high volumes out of scuppers. So there is no way to divert the drencher water into a separate tank to retain it and prevent the maritime environment being damaged or infected or polluted. So this has to be thought of by the vessel operator. Then biohazards, inhalation risks, crew or passenger illness and their liability. I again refer to the safety data sheet, and it categorically states that long-term effects of this vaccine are unknown. So how do you do that? Are you willing to take that liability? Not only that, in certain jurisdictions, we have got a part of the population which is called the vulnerable group, such as those who are recovering from cancer or who have certain illnesses or who are above a certain age. So as an operator, I would want to ensure that the crew on that shift, which is transporting the cargo or on that particular voyage, is not part of that vulnerable group of population. You won't find this in any of the guidance, but they have to bring in the SOLAS, ISM code, IMDG code, and the national regulations, as well as generic guidance, so that all of these are addressed. Finally, ship stability, vessel systems we have looked at. What about decontamination? Joss and Thomas have addressed liabilities between parties, but does that cover short-term and long-term costs of decontamination? And what about commercial issues? What about the time and money lost for that? So it just brings me to the next slide. Please, expert advice needs to be considered before you accept this cargo, and then you prepare, you do your contingency planning, get your approval, and you indulge in safe carriage of this cargo. It is not difficult. It just needs a good amount of preparation. Thank you.
Amarinder, thanks so much for that. And I'd now like to invite all of the panelists back to the virtual stage, so to speak, and I'll hand over to Simon, who, as I said earlier, will marshal us through the Q&A session. Simon, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Josh. And thank you, Rod, thank you, Tom and Amarinder, for your presentations. We had a very good introduction to the overall problem, the protection issues and the practical transport issues. We've had a few questions starting to come in. So to start, perhaps at a gentle level, first of all, just in terms of the volumes of vaccines to be shifted, do we have a feel for how much is shipped by sea in comparison with what's shipped by air, or likely to be so? Rod mentioned 1 billion doses a year. Are the slots available? And I think there's a question there, perhaps for Rod and Amarinder, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. So I think the existing capacity that might have been available through long-haul air travel isn't there at the moment. It might come back, and we've got a much greater demand for this stuff. So I think the greater proportion of it will be covered, will be carried by sea. I also am just getting around to the idea that in the initial stages of the world vaccination program, where we need to bring this stuff forward quite quickly, it might be that we see a state intervention, either in the provision of capacity or in expediting these kind of cargoes above everything else. So yes, a greater proportion by sea, and yes, we might see some state-based help in moving this stuff forward.
Thank you, Rod. Amarinder, do you have anything on the comparative shipment by sea? And then I'm going to ask a supplementary from your side. Might be a little bit unfair, but do we know whether these vaccines are subject to being disturbed on a rough sea passage or anything like that? Might be an unfair question.
First, regarding the transport volume by sea, everything comes down to economics. Health first, as Rod pointed out, state intervention, get the population safe. Once a critical level is done, then it's all down to economics. Air freight is expensive, shipping is cheap at the cost of time. So I believe that it will come down to regular sailings, but quite later. Initial transportation would be by the fastest means necessary. Regarding the next question, can you repeat that again, please, Simon?
Yeah. Are the vaccines subject to damage in rough seas? You know, do they get shaken up and destroyed in any way?
I'm not a doctor, but I've always seen doctors, giving the vial a good shake before they put it in the injection. So I don't think that's an issue for this.
No, it's not really a technical question for us. I think that's the case maybe. Another sort of practical transport thing for Rod maybe again and Tom, just a question of there's various discussions about theft. And piracy, maybe, are we looking at any special arrangements for that? And what is the liability on that?
Okay, so theft is endemic. Oh, so, no, let me choose my words a little bit more carefully. Theft is not unusual in the container trade, either from a truck or from a container terminal, where it's a relatively straightforward thing for an insider to do to modify the movement orders for a particular box using a computer, because it's not possible to do this sort of thing by hand, so that boxes get moved about. So inevitably somebody's going to think that that helping themselves to COVID vaccine might very well be a lucrative pursuit for them, and so I'm sure we're going to see that happen. However, as I've said, in the case of theft with normal pharma cargoes, that whole batch is then generally pulled because it's taken out of the supply chain, so it's immediately identifiable as black market stuff. So I think actually the theft of one box of cargo could have a ripple effect in terms of the claim that might subsequently arise.
Okay, thank you. Tom, there's a few questions in here about sort of liability for the carriage of these. Do you have anything to add on that?
Not really. I mean, I think we looked at the way that the reefers are, the responsibility for reefers are divvied up. I think that some of those more restrictive roll-on, roll-off terms, where they're not even taking responsibility for the power supply, may find themselves not being compatible with Hague-Visby rules and the responsibilities for care of cargo in the event that the Hague-Visby rules are applied by force of law and you can't derogate from them. But otherwise, I think, and as Rod is the expert on these additional insurance arrangements and that go on with the pharmaceutical companies, I think that the carriers will be reluctant to step outside their comfort zone for a number of reasons from their contracts of carriage.
Okay, thank you. No, there's quite a few coming in now on the Q&A. So how is this new, what we're doing now? The question is, how did existing vaccines get shipped in the past? Is anything really changed, or is it just that we're seeing more about it in the news at the moment?
Well, Simon, I think firstly, yeah, we're noticing a bit more because it's newsworthy and the volume's going up. Vaccines shipped all the time, but most vaccines normally live between -4 and +2. So they've just fitted into the existing cold chain in a very straightforward way. And there hasn't been that emotional attachment to ordinary vaccines. So now it's an interesting thing, but the World Health Organization, here's a little factoid, estimate that about half of all vaccines with active pharmaceutical ingredients are lost in transit by going out of set point or being damaged or destroyed in some way. That's quite a loss rate. Now, is that going to be sustainable for COVID-19 vaccines? It's a fairly open question. My guess would be not.
I suspect we'd be hearing a lot more about it anyway. Okay, a technical question here, maybe for Amarinder. Is there a standard to which reefer units need to conform to? I think you addressed that a little bit in terms of that. Perhaps you'd like to answer that one.
Yes, there is actually a ISO standard for containers or multimodal containers. And so the reefer container must conform to that. As far as the cooling down machinery is concerned, that is for the line or the manufacturer from where the shipper is leasing the cargo to verify whether that equipment can cool down or maintain the temperature of the cargo. There is another question which I would want to address here, which talks about cooling down to -50 and carriage at -70. Now, reefer containers can only maintain that temperature. They cannot cool down the cargo. So the cargo is often loaded pre-cooled in these containers for carriage. And your container has to be capable of maintaining that temperature. There are some reefers called supercool reefers, which I do see mentioned. If you Google, you'll find them, which are suitable for those temperature ranges.
Okay, and there's a related question that's coming actually on the chat side of things. Normal reefers cool down to approximately -50. The Pfizer vaccine requires -70. Does that effectively exclude the Pfizer vaccine from maritime transport? And I think we're saying no, because it's separately sort of packaged within itself. Is that right?
Yes, so they will bring down the transport. They will make provisions to transport that vaccine on the maritime trade. So it would either be cooling down or, as I mentioned earlier, dry ice or nitrogen. And in any case, the carriage would be under class 6.2 and maybe with class 2 and 9 add on with that. So in any case, the shipper will ensure that the containment system is fit for transport. And as far as the maritime operators are concerned, they have to receive it at the temperature, maintain that temperature based on that technology, and deliver it at the same temperature. And that's all there is to it.
Okay, and that leaves a question for Tom, actually. Does the club have much experience dealing with cargo claims for pharmaceuticals in general, perhaps, and IMDG class 6.2 cargoes? Is this something new, or has this been going for a while?
It's not something new. We do have experience with them. The example that springs to mind is that we had a 6.2 cargo clinical waste, fairly vague description on the shipping documents, but there was a leak with a vessel going into port. It was all declared. There was port health took this very seriously. The vessel was delayed for quite a lengthy period. When she was eventually allowed in, she had to go to a special berth. There were special discharge arrangements and cleaning arrangements. So yes, on top of the normal sort of run-of-the-mill cargo claims complications that you get, we had all these additional measures to sort out with the authorities and the decontamination. In that case, it turned out to be poor stowage inside the reefer units, which caused a leak. But there was an element of some of the issues that Aminder's touched on about specialist equipment and training that was needed, and a lack of information that had, as it turned out, been provided by the shipper.
Okay, thank you. And as my clock is tinging in my ear just behind me, I've realised that we sort of reached the end of our allotted span. There are a few other questions which we could handle, and we will answer questions that have been raised in writing. So is this the time? Perhaps I wonder if I might just draw people's attention. LOC have adopted the Mission to Seafarers, and in particular their Flying Angel campaign for COVID-19 response as our charity, our chosen charity. We're just putting up a couple of slides about the work they do. Some of you may have been on some other LOC webinars, and we've actually had Andrew Wright speak and extol the virtues of the work which they're doing. Many of my colleagues are mariners in one way or another, as you heard from the panel, so are they. And the particular work which the Mission to Seafarers is having to do, looking at how they can achieve things remotely, using technology, as indeed we're all finding in our work. The extra work they're having to do to be able to keep going with ships arriving, and how they can look after them and being COVID safe, and basically just needing funds in general. So we're just going to invite you to show an interest perhaps, or to support them. They're going to run a virtual Christmas Carol service on the 9th of December. And if anybody chooses or would like to donate, their website and a donation link are on the screen now. So we certainly support them, and if other people would like to support them as well, I know they'd be very grateful. Thank you very much. So Joss, I'll leave you to wind up then.
Well, Simon, thanks for that, and totally endorse your messages around the Mission to Seafarers, a great charity, and I hope that those listening can find a way of supporting somehow. I'd like to thank all of the panellists first and foremost, and LOC for facilitating, get out at the end, this webinar. Incredibly knowledgeable. You've all done a huge amount of homework putting together those presentations, and I think we can all leave this webinar feeling perhaps not with all the answers, but certainly more informed regarding the issues that we are going to face regarding the safe carriage of these COVID-19 vaccines. So I think, forewarned is forearmed. And again, I'd like to thank you all for your input today. I think it's been invaluable. And let's hope it will be the start of a conversation that will take place through the industry as we get prepared to shift these vaccines around the world. So thanks all so much, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.